Comedy is all about everything that goes wrong. Think about it for a second. What do comedians tend to joke about? David Sedaris writes about his humiliations, like when he was in elementary school, being forced to see a speech therapist for his lisp, and how his teacher announced to the class each and every day, "David, don't forget you have a speech therapy session at 2:30. Asif Mandvi talks about the shame he faced when auditioning for a TV advertisement. The director's assistant asked if he owned a turban and if he knew how to charm snakes. Mandvi said, "I don't, but I am Indian, so it's probably in my DNA." Sarah Vowell writes about insomnia by explaining that while she's not the advice-seeking, therapy-going, professional help-getting kind, she suffers so much that she pledges to break my personal declarations of independence and ask for help to finally get some sleep. Taken at face value, these subjects aren't that funny. Grade school mortification, Hollywood racism, and living with insomnia. But as Steve Allen, the first host of The Tonight Show, explains in his book, How to Be Funny, the raw material of most comedy is painful. It's about how dumb people are, how drunk or stoned they were last night, how broke they are, how poor, how bow-legged, greedy or lazy. Much of the best humor is found in the tragic reality of human experience. Our understanding that laughter often comes from suffering has actually been around for a long time. In the classical age, the Roman dramatist Plautus coined the term tragicomedy. This was when he was trying to figure out what to call a play that's funny and yet has serious elements. In his play Amphitryon, the character of Mercury says, "I shall mix things up. Let this play be a tragicomedy." Later on, during the Renaissance, Shakespeare joked in A Midsummer Night's Dream about his most lamentable comedy. And in the 18th century, social critics Joseph Addison and Sir Richard Steele said that their chief aim in writing satirical essays was to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. And then there's the poet Lord Byron. During the Romantic period, he said in his epic parody, Don Juan, "And if I laugh at any mortal thing, 'tis that I may not weep." Popular sayings about the nature of comedy suggest that, even today, we laugh to avoid crying. These sayings populate greeting cards, memes, and blogs. Examples include, "Comedy is tragedy that happens to other people," and "Comedy is tragedy revisited," and "Tragedy plus time equals comedy." So we clearly believe that it's better to turn to laughter rather than to hurt, embarrassment, fear, humiliation, or sadness. But why is this true? Why do humorists turn misfortune into the stuff of comedy? Aristotle thought that the effects of tragedy on an audience can be cleansing, purifying emotionally, that laughing is cathartic for the writer and the audience, and that it is a means of purging one's fears to restore emotional equanimity. Take, for example, a stand-up routine by the comedian Tig Notaro. When Notaro hit the stage at a club called the Largo in Los Angeles, she'd just gone through a pretty rough 4 months. She'd contracted pneumonia. Then she'd been hospitalized with an infection. And then Notaro's mother died accidentally. Her mother just tripped and hit her head only a week after Notaro got out of the hospital. And when it would seem that things couldn't get any worse, Notaro went through a messy breakup. It was tough times, Notaro told Ira Glass, the host of the weekly radio show This American Life. And your partner can't stick around for that. Gotta get out before the cancer comes. And that is exactly what happened. Having struggled through 2 debilitating illnesses, having grieved over her mother's unexpected death, and after making it through a breakup, Notaro was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. What was she going to do now? Well, she decided that the only way to deal with this colossal train wreck was to turn to what she knew best, comedy. The day after she found out that she had cancer, Notaro put on a show at the Largo. The beginning of her routine sets the tone for the whole act. She picks up the mic and says to her audience, "Good evening, hello, I have cancer." From here, Notaro gets edgier and edgier. At one point, she explains that after she learned the bad results from a biopsy, the doctors made her have another mammogram. "And I had to have my shirt off," she says, "and I was standing there at the machine, and the technician said, 'Oh my gosh, you have such a flat stomach. What is your secret?'" Notaro pauses for a moment, timing her next line just right. "And I was like, oh, I'm dying." Throughout the monologue, Notaro's audience sometimes laughs, sometimes they gasp, sometimes they giggle nervously. For example, Notaro mentions a greeting card that she got from a friend, one that had a sad face on the front with the phrase, "So you have cancer." On the inside it says, "I've been looking for a reason to shave my head." As you can imagine, her listeners hardly made a sound. But Notaro heckled the crowd when it didn't laugh hard enough. She said, "I can't believe that that's what you guys haven't laughed at tonight. That was straight from the funny cancer greeting card industry." It's clear that Notaro's audience doesn't know where the line is between the comedic and the tragic. And that's a risk any humor essayist runs. When you're joking about some of the most difficult aspects of the human condition, it's hard to know when you might go too far. So, I have two pieces of advice for knowing what's going too far and what's just right when it comes to writing humor essays. My first piece of advice is to make fun of your own suffering. Joke about your own life. Now and then you might delve into the shortcomings of others, but it's better to be self-deprecating. My second piece of advice is to pay close attention to the masters of the humor essay and read them. Reading the work of funny people is pretty straightforward and also enjoyable. You might start with some of the earliest examples of humor essays, such as those written by the 18th century satirists, Sir Richard Steele and Joseph Addison. They exposed the foibles of their fellow Englishmen and women in the pages of two magazines they founded and edited, The Tatler and The Spectator. The ways that Addison and Steele poke fun at outrageous fashions, stultifying religious practices, melodramatic performances, and social posturings of those in the military, the government, the arts, and the aristocracy are definitely worth your time. Students of the humor essay would also do well to pay attention to the comedic writings of Washington Irving, who is best known now for his short stories about Rip Van Winkle and the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. But Irving is a comic genius and a great storyteller. In particular, I'm thinking of the humor essays found in Irving's sketchbook, written under the pseudonym Geoffrey Crayon. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a sketch was a brief extemporaneous essay on an amusing topic, and Irving was an expert in the form. Choice bits from Irving include an essay called The Art of Bookmaking, in which he suggests that unimaginative authors who write bad literature are a bit like the witches in Macbeth, stirring up a cauldron of bad soup. Here a finger, there a thumb, mixed with their own gossip poured in. Another piece, called The Boar's Head Tavern, reads a little like a detective story. It's about how Irving tried and failed to locate the pub where Shakespeare's Sir John Falstaff held forth, forever drunk and yet forever lovable. And then an essay about London antiques. It discusses musty and dusty objects sold by very talkative proprietors who wind up dispelling all the magic and mystery of their antiques with their tiresome palaver. Then, almost a century later, of course, there's Mark Twain. Beyond his fame as the author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Twain was a prolific journalist, lecturer, and essayist who made comic capital out of everything he saw and heard. In particular, I recommend his book, What is Man? And Other Essays, and his travelogue, The Innocents Abroad, about the Victorian fad of middle-class Americans going on grand tours of Europe. One of those tourists was Mark Twain. Across his humor pieces, Twain makes clear, as he says, that my object is not to tell the truth, but to make people laugh. I treat my readers as unfairly as I treat everyone else, eager to betray them at the end with some monstrous absurdity or some extravagant anticlimax. There are also many, many contemporary humor essayists worth studying and chuckling over. In addition to David Sedaris, Asif Mandvi, and Sarah Vowell, those that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, others include James Thurber, Irma Bombeck, Woody Allen, Steve Martin, Nora Ephron, Anne Lamott, Garrison Keillor, and David Rakoff, among many, many more. Now, the best lesson I've learned from reading these comic essayists is how and why self-deprecating humor is so essential to their collective ethos or credibility. Consider Woody Allen, whose essays are a parade of his neuroses, or Garrison Keillor, who jokes about his height, his age, his Midwesternness, his lack of technological know-how, and his growly singing voice. Or Irma Bombeck, whose column, At Wit's End, made relentless fun of her middle-class suburban existence and tedious experiences as a housewife. Or Nora Ephron, who published a droll novel called Heartburn that is but a thinly veiled dissection of her disastrous marriage to journalist Carl Bernstein. As these authors find hilarity in their own pain and suffering, readers wind up recognizing their flaws, insecurities, and social failings, and so can laugh at them. By way of an extended example, let's look more closely at the work of David Sedaris, whose primary genre is the humor essay. He's published many essay collections, including Me Talk Pretty One Day, which won the prestigious Thurber Prize for American Humor. Me Talk Pretty One Day is primarily about how Sedaris moved to Paris in hopes of learning how to speak French and had only marginal success in doing so. Sedaris explains that over time, it became impossible to believe that any of us in my French class would ever improve. It was mid-October when the teacher singled me out, saying, "Every day spent with you is like having a cesarean section." And it struck me that, for the first time since arriving in France, I could understand every word that someone was saying. And so it was with great joy that I responded, "I know the thing that you speak exact now. Talk me more, you." Now, if you're not familiar with Sedaris, you might not know how he got his big break in the early 1990s. He was invited to read one of his comic pieces, The Santaland Diaries, on the Morning Edition radio show, and it became one of the most popular stories ever broadcast on National Public Radio. This humor essay is indicative of Sedaris' signature style, which is making relentless fun of himself. One example of this in the Santaland Diaries is when Sedaris explains, "I'm a 33-year-old man applying for a job as an elf at Macy's department store. I often see people in the streets dressed as objects and handing out leaflets. I usually avoid leaflets, but it breaks my heart to see a grown man dressed as a taco. So if there is a costume involved, I tend not only to accept the leaflet, but to accept it graciously, saying, 'Thank you so much,' and thinking, 'You poor son of a bitch.' But instead, I'm the one applying for a job as an elf. I told the interviewers that I wanted to be an elf because it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard of. I figured that for once in my life I would be completely honest and see how far it got me. But they hired me because I'm short. So now my costume is green. I wear green velvet knickers, a forest green velvet smock, and a perky little hat decorated with spangles. This is my work uniform." When you pay close attention to Sedaris' humor, what immediately becomes clear is that he never condemns someone else without also condemning himself. While the human taco is the butt of a joke, the Taco Man story is a way to reveal Sedaris' own prejudices against being a grown-up and making a living dressed as an object or a character. This confession comes back to bite him, of course, when Sedaris becomes a short-statured 33-year-old man wearing green knickers who must prance around a department store pretending to be one of Santa's helpers. So now the reader is the one who thinks, "You poor son of a bitch." Sedaris goes on to explain about the silly shoes Macy's elves must wear, the elf dress rehearsal they are required to attend, and the children's tantrums, the vomiting, and the verbal abuse that the elves must endure. Sedaris has turned the tables so that the reader feels relief at not having to work as an elf or as a taco, even as Sedaris himself comes off as pitiful. This willingness to make fun of himself gives Sedaris a strong ethos or credibility, as someone who is secure enough to admit his weaknesses and silliness. But self-criticism isn't the only basis of Sedaris' wit. As any good humor essayist should, he goes to the next level and engages his reader's empathy by turning the comedic into the cathartic. Over the decades, Sedaris has published more than 40 humor essays in the New Yorker magazine. One of my personal favorites is called "Understanding Owls: What Does the Gift Say About the Giver?" This piece is an excellent example of how self-deprecating humor can foster empathy. The premise of the piece is simple and familiar. Sedaris wants to find the perfect Valentine's Day gift for his partner, Hugh. But as so often happens in a long-term relationship, the gift-giving stakes have gotten higher and higher over the years. Where Sedaris and Hugh used to exchange chocolates and cigarettes, now their gifts are more idiosyncratic and more expensive. Like everything else, Sedaris explains, holiday gifts escalate. That is, until you're with your beloved for so long that you don't really want or need anything else, and so you start making donations to favorite charities in each other's name. But Sedaris and Hugh are still at the relationship stage of trying to surprise and please each other with elaborate gifts. And so Sedaris decides to buy Hugh a taxidermied owl. Almost impossible to buy, given the wildlife protection laws for animals on the endangered species list. But such owls are sometimes available in England, which is where the two of them happen to be living. So after making a call to a London taxidermy shop and discovering that the owner has not one but 2 owls for sale, Sedaris hops on the underground metro to check them out. Once he gets to the shop, though, what he discovers is not at all what he expected. Yes, there are 2 owls for sale, both in good shape, but what throws Sedaris off track is that the taxidermist also shows him a series of oddities that would be more appropriate for a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum or a cabinet of curiosities. One is a human skeleton that's hiding in the back of the shop. Sedaris guesses it must be the skeleton of a teenager, given how small the bones are. The shopkeeper tells him, "Nope, it's a pygmy." The taxidermist goes on to explain that during the Victorian period, the English invaded the Congo and hunted these people, tracked them down, and shot them for sport. Sedaris writes, "Funny how quickly this changed the mood." Another item the taxidermist unveils is an amputated forearm under a glass dome. "Touch it," the taxidermist says, and Sedaris admits, "I did," shuddering a little at the feel of the hairs. Next, the shopkeeper brings out his pièce de résistance, the 400-year-old head of a young girl. Her skin is dry, like the leather on an old, worn-out purse. Sedaris is horrified, but fascinated. He quickly pays for his owl and leaves. On the subway ride home, holding the Valentine owl in a cardboard box, Sedaris wonders what was so unnerving about the meeting with the taxidermist, whether it was the stuffed human body parts or something else. What he finally comes to is this: while it's common for people to misunderstand or to misread others around them, it is much less common for them to size up another person accurately and immediately. The taxidermist, Sedaris explains, knew me for less time than it took to wipe my feet on his mat, and with no effort whatsoever, he looked into my soul and recognized me for the person I really am, the type who'd actually love a pygmy, and could easily get over the fact that he'd been murdered for sport, thinking breezily, well, it was a long time ago. Worse still, I would flaunt it, hoping that this would become a part of my identity. They say he has a pygmy, I could imagine my neighbors whispering. But how did the taxidermist know? If we strip away the humor, obviously there's some not so funny, some truly nasty information contained within this essay. For one, we're told that when Victorians were waging war and forcing people into slavery in the Congo, they hunted down other human beings and killed them for fun. For another, we learn that Sedaris isn't terribly bothered when he sees the pygmy skeleton and is assured by the taxidermist that the man didn't die of a heart attack. Instead, the only question that comes to Sedaris' mind is how much the pygmy costs. And we also discover that Sedaris is a braggart. If he actually bought this skeleton, he would display it in his living room for all to see. And he would relish the idea of people in his neighborhood gossiping about how he owned this pygmy. Because Sedaris couches this entire scene in humor and makes sure to question his own base desires in front of the reader, we come to trust him even more as our narrator. His humor makes him more credible. It isn't founded on attacking other people or things, which is a cheap form of emotional appeals or pathos. Instead, if he's attacking anyone, he's attacking himself. Sedaris knows that his fantasy to purchase and display a murdered pygmy is a grotesque, covetous, and even sinister desire. And so by confessing these uncomfortable emotions, he creates empathy. As readers, we too have dark desires. Maybe we don't want to own the skeleton of a brutalized pygmy, but maybe we like the idea of being notorious and of having people whisper about us in the street. Or maybe we have a fascination for bones and body parts because they are the omen of our own impending deaths. And maybe, too, we are unhinged when someone recognizes these less than savory aspects of our own personalities. With such honest confessionality in the service of humor, Sedaris creates real rather than false appeals to pathos. He's not being sensational for its own sake. He's not shocking just to shock or grossing a reader out just to gross him out. Instead, we readers laugh at the creepiness of the situation, his willingness to be brutally honest about some pretty disturbing desires. And that's because we're really laughing at our own disturbing desires. Sedaris uses many elements of good essay writing to make his humorous scenes vivid and realistic. For one, his descriptive details are exact. Instead of telling the reader that the taxidermist brought out a human arm, it's a man's forearm, complete with little hairs and a smudged tattoo. Sedaris also shapes funny scenes with elaborate settings, characters, and lines of dialogue, which make his essays active and distinct. When describing Macy's Santaland, he doesn't say that it's beautiful. Instead, he demonstrates how and why it's beautiful by employing strong sense-based details. Santaland is a wonderland with 10,000 twinkling lights and diversions. People enter and walk through a maze which affords views of mechanical dancing penguins, train sets, spinning bears, and really big candy canes. Then they wind up at the magic tree, at which point they brace themselves for Santa. And then Sedaris creates humor by giving the reader an unlikely comparison, though it's precise. The tree is a tunnel designed to resemble a complex system of roots. The child is supposed to think, I can't believe I'm inside a tree. But instead, I think it looks like a large scientific model of the human intestinal tract. So, as you read humor writers, pay attention to how they make fun of themselves while asking the reader to experience the same roller coaster emotions, no matter how raw or taboo, disgusting, or scandalizing. The more shockingly honest the humor essayist is, often the more credible she seems, particularly if she's self-deprecating. And notice, too, that the more active and scene-like, as well as the more precise and descriptive a humor essay is, the more compelling it becomes. It's just so much funnier to imagine a 33-year-old Sedaris wearing green velvet knickers, a forest green velvet smock, and a perky little hat decorated with spangles than it would be for him to say, "My elf costume is green." So you can see why Sedaris is my go-to model for writing humor essays. As you search for your own comedic mentors, your aim is to distinguish between the cheap and easy jokes of those who just bash other people, or who are obscene in the hopes of getting a laugh because the reader just can't believe that someone wrote that. This kind of comedy is easily forgotten. It's the stuff of dumb blonde jokes and foul language and crude sex talk that's really no more sophisticated than playground humor. To write an effective humor essay is to use the comedic in service of the tragic, to make fun of disability, disease, hate, war, violence, cruelty, and death. As strange as it might sound, I believe that a comedic essay that isn't written in the service of self-knowledge and social enlightenment is nothing more than a funny tirade. If you'd like to try it yourself, here's an exercise in writing cathartic rather than just cheap humor. First, choose something for your life that really wasn't funny at all. Maybe, like Tig Notaro, you've survived cancer or some other illness. Or maybe, like David Sedaris, you've worked at humiliating jobs and worn horrible uniforms. Or maybe, also like Sedaris, you've realized that there are aspects about your personality that are unpleasant to admit, that you're competitive with your coworkers, that you hated the children you used to babysit, even though they loved you, that you fantasize about secretly flying off to an island paradise when your in-laws are scheduled for a visit. Then write it all down, every excruciating detail. Get down all the disagreeable bits about undergoing dialysis, about clicking through each and every Facebook photograph showing a 300-pound ex-beauty queen you went to high school with, or about slipping around in the grease of your own cooking oil at a fast food job, where you made French fries for hours and hours for lazy people who couldn't get out of their own cars to pick up their own food. That's right. Be churlish as well as descriptive. Let it all hang out. Then go back and reread your own bile. As you do so, think about how you are implicated in all of this nastiness. If you've written about your competitive nature, ask yourself, why are you so competitive? Are you insecure because you think your coworkers are smarter than you? Or are you angry because you think you're the smarter one and they don't deserve the credit they receive? Or if you resented those kids you took care of as a babysitter, did you resent them because you had to be responsible while they got to mess around? Or did you not like them because you just aren't comfortable around kids? You didn't know what to say to them or what to do with them. Be willing to admit your faults and limitations. Then finally, try to draft a humor essay in which you tell your bitter story about that coworker or that ex-beauty queen or that detestable fast food job. But as you tell it, make sure to show both sides. Be highly detailed about what you didn't like about the experience or the person. Be detailed about how the situation reveals your weaknesses, insecurities, spite, and small-mindedness. And make fun of yourself, at least as much as you make fun of your topic. Remember that even though you're joking about your subject and yourself, your goal is to wield humor with a purpose, to get the reader to empathize with the absurdities of your angst and plights, and in so doing have the ability to laugh at the misfortune in their own lives. Mark Twain said, "Humanity had one really effective weapon: laughter. Power, money, persuasion, supplication, persecution, these can lift at a colossal humbug, push it a little, crowd it a little, weaken it a little, century by century. But only laughter can blow it to rags and atoms at a blast. Against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand.